Hi, I'm Charlotte Kanye, and welcome back to the Find Your Birth Confidence Summit. And today I'm welcoming Rebecca Schiller, who does a lot of work with human rights in childbirth and is also a mother herself. So welcome, Rebecca.
Hello.
Hi. So I wonder if you'd tell me a little bit more about yourself and how you became passionate about supporting women in birth.
It's a bit of a long story, and I am known to waffle, so I will try and keep it short. But it's really through, like a lot of people, through my own experiences of becoming a mother. I got my dream job working for an American human rights NGO when I was 26 or 27. I'd interned there and gone off and done various things, but I'd come back to have quite a senior post in the department that I'd interned in. Wasn't really interested particularly in women's rights. It hadn't really been something that was, motivating to me. And then suddenly I was pregnant and thrown into this completely new world. I ended up booking a doula and having a really positive experience of giving birth at home, and suddenly felt really vocational about leaving my previous work behind and becoming a doula, working one-to-one with women and with new families through birth and beyond. And it was that experience of being with all kinds of people as they gave birth, first babies, second babies, home births, cesareans, complex situations, single parents, that I realised that the human rights world that I'd been in was very relevant to birth, and I started writing about birth and met a human rights barrister, Elizabeth Prohaska, who said she was thinking of forming a human rights in childbirth charity, and would I be interested in doing it with her. And so in the space of a few years, I went from someone who had no interest in birth, no interest in women's rights, was planning my office-based, human rights career, to being a doula and a human rights and childbirth campaigner, and somehow starting to be a journalist and a writer, writing about all kinds of things, but lots about birth too. So actually my experience of becoming a mother not only changed my life in the ways that it often does, but it completely shifted my priorities and my career.
Wow, I think it's quite common, but it's really great of how that shift, the skills you had, and then that is amazing. I love that. I didn't know that.
Yeah,
about you. I just know what you do now. And what are the kind of issues that you became aware of that led you to change your interest into human rights in childbirth?
I think it was a couple of things kept coming up with the doula clients I was working with, which one is the being allowed to do something versus being coerced or strongly encouraged, or having your options very limited. So I was working with people who wanted home birth and wanted to use a birth centre, or wanted to elect a cesarean. They were finding that very difficult, either because they were told they had to do things a certain way. They met people who laid on a lot of highly emotive pressure to do things a certain way. And then because I was a doula and I was working with them for the long term, I would see the impact that had on them through the pregnancy, in the birth and postnatally. And sometimes I would see the impact it had again in a second pregnancy. So I could see that what in larger conversations was seen as quite a minimal thing, you're not allowed to use the birth centre, birth just one day, a healthy baby is all that matters, that actually these restrictions and this undermining of women at this point when they felt very vulnerable could have quite a profound impact, not just on the birth, not just on the postnatal period, but on how they felt about themselves. And then in birth settings, I was seeing issues around consent. So I felt like I was seeing things happen to women sometimes that wouldn't be okay in other situations, but were somehow taken as okay in a birth setting. So things really that felt were being done to women that they didn't understand why, and they didn't have the chance to consent to, and sometimes that they were actively saying they didn't want and was happening anyway. and then I was seeing that alongside some really positive examples of amazing care, and sometimes in really difficult situations where midwives and doctors would enable women not necessarily to have the shiny birth plan that they had, exactly wanted in advance, but they were enabling them to work together with the team in changing circumstances to make the best decisions for themselves, and they were treating those women as intelligent individuals who were the most important person in the room. And I saw the huge positive impact that made, the amazing births that took place, even sometimes when they were completely off plan, and the positive impact that was having on women. And those were the kind of things that made me think this is a much bigger issue than just I want to use a birth pool because I do. This was an issue of power and control and identity, and that it was something that I felt quite politically motivated by as a feminist.
That's really interesting, power, control and identity, because as a mother you're changing your identity. You're extremely powerful in birth, and there's not a lot of control of how the birth energy is coming through. It's different from the control of, say, going to work where you know what's going to happen. And so I'm thinking about that side, and then the meeting of an external control and power system, and that battle, like an age-old battle that's playing out in the birthing room.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that there's a real mismatch between where we've got to in I'm thinking about here in a UK context, where we've got to when it comes to women's rights and the women's movement and ideas of consent, and where equality conversations, what we're saying to what I felt was said to me as I grew up about my place in the world and what I would be able to have and how I was in control of my body and my life, didn't necessarily match with what I have discovered through my experiences of parenting, not just birth, actually. I think parenting more broadly. So there's a really interesting tension for women who are mothers now, that maybe as opposed to a couple of generations ago where our place in society was taken as read, we're now in a place where we're told we might expect quite a lot, but the reality is very different. And I think that's a really hard place to be. And it's maybe why the identity stuff comes in, because then you translate that back on yourself. Oh, well, I was supposed to be able, I thought it was all about choice now in childbirth. So if I'm not, it must be my fault. This is what I've been told. And I think that's really leaving women in a difficult place, and why I think it's a really important feminist issue that we've got to catch up with lots of other areas of society and life in the birth world.
Right. It can come as quite a shock, can't it? Women have been told they've got choice and starting to look into the choices, read nice books, and then the reality is mismatched. What do you suggest to a woman who's listening, who either that maybe it hasn't happened yet, or maybe it has and she can recognize that mismatch? What would you suggest to help her get through that and get the confident birth she wants?
I mean, I think knowing that this is not your fault, that this is something that lots of women face at various points in their pregnancies and births, and lots of them go on to navigate that and go on and find a positive solution. So it's not you, we're still in a world that's catching up with itself. I think it's really important to know and understand what your options are. So I think being really well informed is helpful. So finding out what, something like the Which Birth Choices website is really good for knowing what are all the local birth options that are available to you. Knowing what your rights are. So Birth Rights, the human rights in childbirth charity that I co-founded, I'm now a trustee of, has got really great fact sheets and some videos on there so that you know what your rights are. You probably won't have to use them, but it's really helpful and empowering to understand what you are entitled to, and that ultimately it is up to you. That's what the law says, it is up to you. And then I think it's finding a place in the system where you feel listened to. So sometimes that's asking to speak to a consultant midwife. Sometimes that's asking if there's any kind of service in your community midwifery scheme where you can see the same midwife time and time again, so you have the chance to build a relationship with someone and say to them, look, this isn't making me feel good. I know that these options exist, I know that these are my rights, but I feel like I'm coming up against a brick wall. What can I do about it? Things like having a doula to support you can be really helpful. Just somebody that knows the system and knows who might be the person to talk to, who comes very much from a women's rights background, who is super supportive. That can be really helpful. And there might be other groups where you might be able to find out that information, positive birth groups. There are still sometimes home birth groups, which I always think are really useful, even if you're not having a home birth. Looking on local Facebook groups as well, so you can see who is the right person for you to talk to. So having a friend in the system, I think, is really, really, really helpful. And if you have a partner or a birth partner, making sure that they are aware of what the options are and what your rights are too, so that they can, in a birth setting, help be your advocate if you are too busy with dealing with contractions, to do that yourself, which does sometimes happen at various points. And I think the final thing is just to also know that even though there are lots of difficult experiences in birth, there are also so many positive experiences too. There are really so many wonderful midwives and doctors out there, so many great places to give birth, and so many people who do go on to have, not necessarily, I gave birth in the Sylvan Woods at moonlight and I just sneezed and the baby popped out, but a really ordinarily, boringly positive birth where, things go to plan, things don't go to plan, but essentially you feel cared for and looked after. And that's the thing that's important.
Yeah, I agree. I had a fantasy for my birth to be snowing in the woods in a little hut with a roaring fire, and it was really helpful actually, because I felt how I felt that was the case, but it was totally unrealistic living in Birmingham to be in the forest in the woods with snow. And I think it was, which sun was it? It was April or something, I think, so it wasn't the right time of year either. Like a heated but the thinking about imagining it made me feel so lovely, and I thought that's the feeling I want. And I recreated that feeling in a more ordinary setting, which was a really bare rented room in a rented house. And so it was very ordinary, but it felt like that inside, like what you can, like you said, you can do a lot to make something really great. I also found I have looked at your fact sheets online, and they're really easily accessible, easy to read. And I didn't know, like, I kind of, you say, human rights in childbirth, you kind of know you have rights, but I think you're kind of going on in your life every day. You don't really think about it most of the time because you're not in a battle. And like you said, we've got so many opportunities that generally we're not having to fight battles of that nature. You hear about it in the news, someone's been unfairly dismissed or whatever. So, I mean, I didn't know so much in my first pregnancy that even when, I think I've shared this on another, but even when my midwife was really respectful and asking for consent, I didn't realise it was asking for consent because I didn't know I could say no. So she said, have you had a vaginal examination? Would you like one? Would you like one now? Well, that's asking for consent, but because I didn't know that it was a choice, I thought she was being polite to say it's time to have your. So she thought she was asking for consent. It was a really good, way to say it. And so I just went yes, and it was lovely. It was all great, no problems there. But I would have said no had I known that was optional. So forming yourself, and she would have been fine with that. She would have been totally fine with that. She was really lovely, absolutely, like you said, the lovely people in the midwives. And so there's a couple of key points on there, I think, that just really sum it up on your human rights of what you have. I can't remember them, you might remember them, just the main statement of that you have the rights, they don't stop in pregnancy, something like that on there. Do you know?
I mean, bodily autonomy is one of the things that we take for granted in a lot of other settings. That nobody has the right to touch us or to do anything to us if we haven't agreed to it, as long as we have mental capacity, which almost all of us do, even if we have mental health conditions, even if we have learning disabilities. There is a particular threshold for someone who doesn't have the capacity to make their own decisions, and that threshold is set at a point at which lots and lots of people who have various challenges still meet that. So for most of us, if something wouldn't be okay, if you were visiting the doctors for a smear test, toenail removal, if you were discontinued any other kind of treatment, then it's not okay in birth. So you expect to have everything explained to you, and you need, when you're making decisions about pregnancy and birth, the law says that your midwife or doctor must explain the risks and benefits to you, not just as they see them, but as they are meaningful to you. So as if I was someone who I was having my first baby by IVF age 44, the risks of something making a future pregnancy difficult probably wouldn't be as important to me as somebody who was having their first baby age 20, who was from a community where they had very, very large families. And so your midwife or doctor needs to know you well enough to explain those risks to you so that you can understand them, and so that they're meeting you. And they must do so with no bias, no coercion. And then ultimately, it is up to you. And there's been various court judgments that have reinforced this. You can, for any reason, however rational or irrational that reason seems, or for no reason at all, decline anything that is offered to you. And of course, the vast majority of women want to make sure they're doing what they feel is the best thing for them and their baby. People don't often make decisions for no reason at all, but that's what the law says. It's absolutely up to you. And the only way for consent to have happened, which is an absolute cornerstone of the law, is if that process has happened, if you've had that discussion, if you really understand it, if it's been made pertinent to you, and you have had the opportunity to say, no thanks, don't fancy that, no, without having undue pressure or coercion on you. And lots of us don't realise that. I didn't realise it in my first pregnancy at all. I remember that I can now look back on the various points in my labour and think, I was really lucky. Really lucky there. So I was really lucky. My waters broke before I went into labour, and I was really lucky that my labour started just before the 24-hour time I've been told I would be induced. Because I didn't realise I could say no to that. I would have definitely gone for an induction. I was really lucky that because my labour was quite fast, no one healthcare professional was there the whole time I was pushing, because actually I probably pushed for 2 or 3 hours. I was fine, baby was fine. She was just a Superman presentation, so she had her hand there, so it just took me a bit longer. But if anybody had been there for 2 or 3 hours, then probably I would have been told I needed to do something different, which in the end for me I didn't need to do. So I look back and I think about all the things that I would have absolutely just thought I had to do, when in fact I didn't necessarily have to do them. I would have appreciated a conversation that gave me the pros and cons. And I think just understanding that it's always not just your right, but it's actually best practice, it's essential practice for all doctors and midwives to do that. Otherwise, they are putting them, they must do that. So you're not asking for anything extraordinary if you say, I don't understand that. You really need to understand, is there an alternative? Are there any risks of this? Are there any benefits of not doing that? That is what should be happening. So it's okay to take the time, and you're actually doing your midwife and doctor a favour by insisting that they give you that information.
Yeah, I agree. And so what I'm hearing from you and from everyone is that it's not actually happening in the vast majority of cases as it should be, and this is why women need to know that this is what should be happening so they can make it happen, because when you do ask the questions you get the answers. This is particularly things that quite common, like sweeps and inductions, and I'm finding that maybe people are getting so used to it happening, we'll give you a sweep for 40 weeks, 41 weeks, and women are going okay, and then that's no one's upsetting if everything goes well, but there's a complete lack of awareness of what that actually means. And like you said, what will it mean in the future? What could happen with that? And a number of women that I've spoken to have gone, well, I didn't realise it would mean this. I didn't realise if I had an induction, I wouldn't then be able to do like in the pool or walking around, all these things. And I didn't realise the contractions would be different and it would be harder. And there is a bias, like you said, of explaining an intervention like induction. It's quite a big topic at the moment, induction. Yeah. I don't know any women that aren't getting basic routine sweeps offered, and induction offered. And I feel like you said, with where you were pushing for 2 or 3 hours and that was fine for you and baby was fine, we seriously underestimate generally perhaps both women and the general system of what women's bodies are actually capable of. I think it points to the bigger feminist picture that you did it. It was just longer than the standard, which I'm not sure historically where the hour pushing, which is usually what I think the standard protocol in hospital is. I love your story.
Yeah, it's and you know, for some people that wouldn't have been the right thing. Some people, you know, would not have wanted to carry on, but there's some really good research that's coming out that shows that when looking at birth trauma, the things that make you more likely to have a clinical sort of level of birth trauma, so you might have symptoms, it might be something that bothers you for a long time and affect your life. It's not necessarily tied to whether you have a classically traumatic experience of birth on paper. The factors that help protect you are being listened to, being treated to kindly, being aware of what's going on and feeling that you have some control over the process. Now, in any kind of birth, with any decisions that are being made, in any level of complexity or even an emergency, those things can happen. You can always have somebody being nice to you. You can always make sure that you don't feel alone, and you can always have some degree of feeling that you are in control of what's happening. That is, of course, difficult in birth because it's not a process that can be entirely controlled. But knowing what's happening, being the person who says yes or no, being aware of what's happening, and being treated in a way that makes you feel important, not as someone who's just an incubator, that is the thing that makes the most difference to whether or not you go on to experience trauma. So that for me is where I had a particular experience of birth. Other people have really different ideas about what's right for them. Lots of people are horrified at the thought of, giving birth at home and there being mess and, not having an opportunity to have an epidural. They feel really reassured by being in that more clinical environment. But you can have that kind of care at home in a cesarean, if you're having an intervention like forceps, that those protective factors can still be present. And the knowing your rights and the having a team that respects your rights really is, for me, a way of making what women have been saying for ages. It's not rocket science. Be nice to me. Tell me what's happening. But it's really helpful sometimes to have that tied up in a nice legal package, because unfortunately women saying this feels good, this feels bad, I need this, is not as successful as saying if you don't do this, you could be negligent, because that has a financial implication. It has an implication on managers and trust lawyers. That's much more compelling, unfortunately, than just, if you ignore me when I say no, it's going to have a long-term effect on my sense of self. Unfortunately, that has less of an impact on the system and the structures than the nice, strong arm of the law.
It's like talking each other's language, really. So women are asking to be spoken to nicely, respected, and to have what they want to be considered as important. And then talking back and talking in legal language is kind of talking the system language, and the system is responding to that. So it's really helpful. And to the law, it feels so, because we're still stuck in that paradigm where there's, like you said, the imbalance of the control or authority, that it would be nice to break it all down, but having the legal backing is part of that system. Having that feels like a strength, to know where you stand on solid ground, that I can say this because look, this is here, you can't argue with that, it's written. Like you said, that's really, I think that really inspires confidence in women, to have that knowledge of backing behind them, like a
there's something and I really noticed that sort of shift. So, you know, when I first started writing about birth and speaking out about birth, I was very much introduced. So if I was going to go on, talk about something on the news, if I was going to write an article, I'd be, you know, a doula who had a home birth. And once I was chief executive of the human rights and childbirth charity Birthright, I can tell you now which version of myself was listened to more. And it was the person with, you know, human rights in the title and chief executive, and unfortunately that more, and I think it is a more traditionally kind of masculine, hard no energy, was much more acceptable and believable than a doula who had a home birth. Now, I'm still a doula who had a home birth. You know, I was actually saying pretty much exactly the same thing. I think the other thing about that is, and I talk and write about this quite a lot, that we get very caught up, understandably, in the way that was right or wrong for us when it came to give birth. And that leads to how we build our identity as a parent and as a mother and then as a person. And so we feel very emotionally attached to that. And that I think can be a bit of a red herring when it comes to campaigning around birth, because then if you gave birth a certain way or something happened to you, you can end up feeling like you're clashing with other people who made different choices. And we can all end up arguing about what kind of birth is the best kind of birth, and talking, you know, whether we should be talking about birth in certain kinds of ways. But actually, I think transcending all of that is that all women basically need the same thing. It's just that because we're all different, it will be a different version. You know, we'll want to give birth in a different way. The way I feel safe is not the way you feel safe. But actually, the treat me like an adult, be kind to me, respect my body, is absolutely what everybody is after. And if we could all come together behind that, you know, that's a lot of the idea behind birthrights and why we don't talk about certain kinds of birth being best, and we'll totally campaign for home birth, and we'll totally, you know, support someone who's had an unassisted birth, and the same with someone who's requesting a cesarean, is that the issues are exactly the same, and it's like a sort of special patriarchal trick to make us all, you know, be debating whether home birth is best or whether hospital birth is best, and put our energies against each other rather than against outside forces. And so I'm quite careful about what I talk about and how often I talk about my experiences of birth, because they can make some people feel quite worried, and so I think until there is a bit more of a tolerant and open-minded culture about the way we talk about giving birth, I'm always quite careful about what I share and what I don't share. I ended up having an accidental unassisted birth for my second baby, and
Me too.
And,
I think it must be more common than you think, because they tend to be quite faster the second babies, and you think it's going to be like the first time.
no, you know, I had a lovely independent midwife, and but it was just my husband and I. But I don't tend to, if I'm going to, you know, go and talk to, you know, 30 obstetricians, I don't start with that.
It's a big leap for them, for a group like that. If there's a group of people who are used to seeing the risks and who are more fearful of birth, it's a bit of a big leap. But as women who are undergoing it ourselves, what I find very common is the woman is more on board for certain things she wants to do, and the husband or partner, might not be a husband, is more fearful of the risks because they're not in it in the body in the same way. They're wanting to protect and keep safe. And I think there's another thing there with sharing positive birth stories can be quite hard, because people who've had a bad one feel like, oh, you know, that comes back into themselves of some unresolved feelings. And then I've heard of a lot of people who are shy to share their positive birth stories, and yet it's so inspiring for women to know that that possibility is there.
Absolutely. And I think it's you know, it depends also how you define positive. You know, I sometimes worry that you know, that we can get very blinkered to how we define positive, that positive means intervention free, or positive is somehow synonymous with the word natural, which I would never use when it comes to birth anyway, but that's how it's seen, and that then somehow there's positive and medicalized in opposition. And of course that's the worst, because most women do give birth in hospital. Most women at the moment do have some kind of intervention. So it's really important that we think about what the basics of you know, what I do in my I wrote a book for pregnant women called Your No Guilt Pregnancy Plan, and one of the things I do in that is try and encourage people to make a plan that's the very basic, starts the very basic of what you need in birth, outside of where you're going to give birth and how it's going to go, but what you really need, something that can be achieved almost whatever happens. And that, you know, I think that's where I come back to those human rights tenets that we're talking about, that actually dignity, humanity, and that can be achieved in almost every situation, and that's where, for me, I wanted to focus my energies, rather than campaigning around home birth, or rather, you know, that something that could work for everyone. But it's really useful sometimes to be able to say, when Birthrights did a particular campaign about maternal request caesareans, because it was an issue, the issue that we are most contacted about actually is women who want to request a caesarean for what are deemed non-medical reasons, though interestingly they are often medical reasons. But we were doing this campaign, and it got a huge amount of publicity, and everyone would assume that I was someone that had fought myself for a caesarean, and that I was very, you know, people were trying to say, oh, yes, but, you know, natural childbirth can be good, you know, obviously you haven't experienced it. And I'd be like, well, actually I've had two home births, one, you know, both very positive experiences. So it is possible to campaign around this issue without having directly experienced it. I have a very positive personal view of birth, and because of that, I can really understand why some people might want to request a caesarean. And that seemed to blow people's minds, that a two-time home birth.
It comes back to what all those points you said about listening and respecting the human being in front, assuming they are autonomous and intelligent, and then if you are listening to them, you can find out why and what will be helpful for them in that, help them to get the caesarean. Sometimes some of those women will change their mind when they're listened to and supported. Some of them won't, because they might have that instinct, and if they didn't get it, their baby would have a complication that means they're going in for an emergency caesarean. They may just know that on some level. And I always think it's worth looking at why there are fears if someone's fearfully choosing an elective caesarean. But again, it's up to the woman whether she wants that, or whether she, you know, like you said, so listening like you're an intelligent adult and facilitating that is the important thing, even if you disagree. Because that's where you've got to start, listening to that person, and no one's ever going to change their mind by being ignored, and you shouldn't be trying to change their mind. That's the whole thing, like, because that's imposing your view, and that's where all the problems start. Because if you do it in a caesarean area, what's going to happen if someone else wants a home birth or natural birth? You're doing it. It's like you said, it's across the board.
But I do get very frustrated. One of the things that really frustrates me is that, you know, when we did that campaign, actually every time Birthrights talks about this issue, we get, particularly on social media, but we get people who are very supportive and vocal and active when it comes to supporting women's rights in birth, on almost all other topics, will be very judgy and critical when it comes to maternal request cesareans. And I've really noticed it. It seems to bring out a similar sense at unassisted birth. People are really not comfortable. And I get really disappointed when I know these people who would say, absolutely, you've had, it's a VBAC and you're 44 and it's twins, but if you want a home birth, go ahead. We support you but we'll then turn around and be very much, the NHS shouldn't be spending resources on cesareans that are unnecessary. And when we did this campaign, it was one of the reasons we did it was because actually it was some of the most distressing cases that we've had to support have been around maternal request cesarean. And that you're right, what happens is the conversation starts with a no, a really hard no. This is what I want, no. And then a huge amount of distrust, a huge amount of anxiety is built up. And fear increases, desperation increases. And we've worked with women who have been really at the edge of what they can bear through this process and treated so inhumanely. And when we did the research looking at why women were requesting that, the most common reason was that they'd had a previously traumatic birth, and the second most common reason was actually a medical complication. So people with spinal issues who'd been told their whole lives that they would have to have a cesarean when they gave birth by their orthopedic doctors, who came to be pregnant and they were told, oh no, it'll be fine, but they'd spent 35 years being told that this was impossible for them. And actually these women were meeting a huge amount of what felt to me like brutality in the system. And so I really, if I encourage anything, it's so much kindness about each other's decisions and choices, and a real that great little graphic that's shown a lot on Instagram with this is how much you know about somebody's life, and this is how much you don't know. And when you have, and I think in every single setting when women are making decisions, they are always making them for reasons. We might not understand the reason, those reasons exist. And if we start with, yes, you have the right to make a decision, yes, I'm going to listen to you, then you might hear those reasons. And as you say, women may be supported to make a decision that actually is a better decision for them, or they may be supported to make the decision that they wanted to make in the first place.
But which might be the completely right decision for them, and it's not your business anyway, ultimately.
Yeah. So, why do people care so much about other people's decisions?
Yeah, it's not going to affect you. It's going to affect that woman and her family.
But we really care about, as a society, we really care about other people's pregnancies, which is interesting from a, if you think about that, why we put so much energy in thinking about other people's pregnancies and feeling it's our business, the bump touching and the unwanted advice, and also other people's babies, the lots of unwanted advice that people get. And why is that? And as a natural,
do you feel that, do you have any ideas why that might be?
It's a species thing, we're very invested in the future of our species in some kind of deep biological way. I went to a really interesting conference where we were talking about how strange the world is right now politically, and how it was very difficult to control the future, but if you've got a sort of visible manifestation of the future, a bump, a woman, and I use that word because that's the word that would be used in that context, that woman is not necessarily seen as a woman, she becomes a bump with a that bump is a physical, that is the future. And if the world feels a bit strange, then putting a lot of focus, a lot of scrutiny, a lot of policing of women and women's bodies because they contain the future is some kind of interesting sort of philosophical reaction. I find that really, really interesting. I also just think we're at an interesting point when it comes to feminism and women's rights, and that it's an area that has remained quite undefended because it's more complex for feminism than lots of other areas.
Yeah.
And so it's a great area to pour your energies if you're anti-women, if you're anti-equality, if you're anti-progress. It's a fantastic place because it remains undefended. And so if you're, if you want to, particularly looking at America and things, if you want to, stop progress on women's rights, then do some work around, limiting women's rights in birth, and that's a great place to start, because there's less people will stand up for birthing women, birthing people than other areas. But yeah, I think there's like a 150,000 word book in there to answer that question.
I'll look forward to it when it comes out.
Yeah, it might be a while.
Might be a while. We might have resolved a few things by then.
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed, yeah. I'd love to hear a bit about your birth stories anyway. I've got a few different ones, including cesareans and of people that have come on the summit. But how did it feel giving birth, and how has it transformed you?
I was really surprised by my experiences of giving birth, both of them actually. I think I didn't quite know what to expect. I come from a very medical family. My dad's a doctor, my mum's a radiographer. I'm very comfortable in hospitals, but I've never really liked, I'm known as the family wimp. Can't tolerate pain, don't like the dentist, don't like needles. So I had expected to want a very traditional experience. My mum said, get an epidural when you're about 6 months pregnant, because see if you just keep it going, because you won't be able to cope. But actually, as my pregnancy went on, I really felt uncomfortable in a hospital environment. I didn't like how I was spoken to, and I didn't like all the fiddling, so I ended up choosing a home birth because I just wanted to be left alone. And I don't like needles. And I thought, if it turns out to be so terrible that the thought of having a needle in my spine is better, then great. I'm really close to the hospital, I'll go and do that. But I can't conceive of something that would be, would be worse than that at the moment. And actually, when I was in labour, I'd gone to some really great preparation classes. I just lay in my bath a lot and made weird noises through each of the contractions, and I found it very manageable because it came from within me. I'm not known to be very good with pain. I don't like being fiddled with, but actually coping with something that was my body doing something was much, it was very intense, and it took all of my being, and I really needed to concentrate on it. But it wasn't, I was expecting it to be awful, and it wasn't. It was kind of, totally manageable. And because of that, we didn't end up calling the midwives because we thought it was still early labour. My whole labour was only 8 hours, so I was sort of waiting for it to get going. And then I was in the bath and I started pushing and we hadn't called the midwives yet. So there was a slightly panicked, couple of hours where we had paramedics come who were hilariously useless. They found me on all fours in my bathroom. I'd got out of the bath and I remembered a position from my antenatal classes where you put your bum in the air if you don't want to give birth with no one. So they found me naked on all fours, my bum in the air. And I had no idea what to do with me. But we had lovely midwives arrive, and the pushing bit was hard, but again, it was all very manageable. And after it had happened and I'd given birth and I realised I'd done this thing, I'd come through it, and it was only a day later and I was in my house and I had a baby and I'd eaten some nice food and everything was exactly the same in my house, except I now had a baby and this knowledge that I'd just done this thing. And it really helped me through all of the difficult adjustments of becoming a parent and feeding, which was a roller coaster for me. Having this thing to hold on to where I thought, yeah, but you did that, you did that thing, really, really helped me. And it made me, very keen to have a similar experience when I had my second baby, though that ended up being a bit too quick for my liking. And it was still really positive. You know, I was, all went really well, and it was lovely afterwards. But I definitely preferred my 8-hour labour to the 40-minute one.
Did anybody think to warn you that you might have a quicker one? Like, because 8 hours is so quick for a first that it's normal for the second to be shorter because you've done it before. Now your body knows. Or did you have any inkling it might be quick?
It would be perfect. Yeah, I mean, I've been to like 40 births in between the two of them. I'd been at a couple of BBAs with second babies, where the baby's born before the midwives arrive. So I knew, but there's knowing and there's knowing, isn't there?
Yeah, well,
and
the way I had a similar experience, so it's interesting.
Okay, with your second baby?
With my second, it's interesting for me to hear whether it parallels me. Well, mine was slightly longer, but the same pattern. So 22 hours, which is more standard for the first, but it's still quite quick for a first birth. And then 3.5 for the second. So I didn't expect that because it was so much quicker. So obviously I didn't call the midwife till I was pushing. Well, I didn't, my husband did it. But the time it took him to work out which number to call, because my mum was supposed to do that, but she hadn't got there, meant that he called the midwife and then called her back to say the baby was there. And then she arrived, you know, like.
I think you can know, there's also that thing where there's a lot. It's one of the reasons why when I'm doing sort of things about writing or speaking about how to prepare for having a baby, that there's just a lot you can't prepare for. You're never going to, you know, you can read every book and you can go to every class and you don't know what's going to happen to you and you don't know how it's going to feel. So if you're going to do anything, investing in the right support, you know, making sure that you have really great support around you during birth and really great support around you afterwards, so that when the thing happens that you have no idea what it is and you don't know how to deal with it, or you feel a way that you didn't imagine, that might be a wonderful way, you have people around you who can help you through that. And that's as far as you can go, I think, with, you know, you can, information is great, all the, you know, it's all really positive, learn loads of birth positions, absolutely do those things because they're really useful. But the best thing is to have those people around you, because even for me, when I had my first baby, I didn't know anything. And when I had my second baby, I was in charge of a birth charity and had been a doula and wrote about birth. And
it still surprised you in some ways of your own experience.
Yeah, I did. So I planned, I really wanted to use a birth pool for both. And I didn't end up doing it for either, even though I own so many birth pools, because I used to do a lending library. So I've blown up a lot of birth pools, but I've never actually given birth in one. The first one, again, it was quite quick. By the time I was pushing, my husband filled the pool with cold water in panic. So I could have got in it if only the water hadn't been cold. Oh, no. And with my but, you know, he did get it up. He got it full of water. It was just
did really well.
But with my second, you know, we'd done a trial run. But we were a four-story narrow seaside townhouse, and I had a bath in my bedroom, which was my favourite place in the world anyway, particularly during my pregnancy. And I did think, based on my experiences at births, that I might not leave that room in time to get down all the flights of stairs and get into the pool. So I had packed a secondary birth bag and left it in our bedroom, because there was a bit of me that thought, by the time I realised things are happening, it may be too late to go down those stairs. And so we did have some big, you know, incontinence pads and all those things that you put out to protect you. We did have that in our bedroom, but I never made it down the stairs to one of my many birth pools. You know, I just had to get out of the bath again and give birth, you know, on the floor by the side of the bath. But it was, you know, it was lovely, and I did it.
What did you prefer about being 8 hours? Was it more time to get used to it, or a different thing that you preferred? Because 40 minutes was quick.
A gradual. So I found that I could, the contractions started and they were very, you know, very easy to cope with, and I could start practicing my coping mechanisms when they were very easy. It also meant there was time for us to go kind of out for a bit of a walk, which was really nice. You know, I had time to eat something, quite a brief amount of time. I remember my waters broke in the afternoon, and then I started having contractions about 11 o'clock at night. We'd been out for a walk, and I had a bath, got into bed with my first baby, and I remember saying to my husband, I put the TENS machine on, I was like, I know you're supposed to try and sleep through the first kind of bit, really don't know that I can. and he said, do you mind if I do?
Which is good comment, you know, because they need to have more energy later on when you don't.
But it was only, you know, an hour later, and I couldn't lie in bed with the TENS machine. I was back in the bath, because it was actually going pretty fast. And I found that also with my first, I was really in tune with my instincts. So I got in that bath and I would not get out of it. And we'd done all these active birth classes. So my husband was on script, and he was saying, we are now going to get out of the bath and mobilize, because he'd been encouraged by the teacher that if someone got stuck in one position, you'd be quite assertive. And I was just like, we're not getting out of the bath. And no, we're not. I mean, unless you've got any chloroform, I'm staying in here. But I was comfortable lying flat on my back in the bath, and it's kind of a good job I did, because I didn't need it to be any faster. I didn't need to mobilize. Everything in my instincts was don't get up and walk around, and I didn't. And so it was time to get used to it, time to build up the coping mechanisms, build up my endorphins, you know, get that so that when the really strong contractions hit, I knew exactly what I was doing. With my second, my waters again broke at the same time of day. I had a really weird thing happen. It was my due date, it's 40 weeks. My daughter had come at 37 weeks. So I was by that point raging with impatience. And my friend who was pregnant with twins, who'd had her first baby at a similar time to me, texted me when I was in the bath and said, my waters just broke. As I read her text, my waters broke.
Wow.
It was just like I was like, oh, mine too. And I completely expected to go into labour that night and have a baby in the night, because that's what had happened before. And I didn't. I had the odd contraction came on overnight. I kind of got up for an hour, had a contraction, went back to bed, but nothing. And so I think because it was a different, I was like, the morning, I was like, I should have had a baby by now. And so when my labour did get going, because there'd been a very stop and start, you know, had a couple of contractions here and there, I didn't really believe in it for the first few contractions. And actually, I'm pretty sure that my whole going from however, you know, early dilated I was to being ready to push happened in one contraction. As I had one contraction that went on for about 5 minutes. And there's nothing you can do to prepare for that. If you've basically been having one contraction every hour that was very light, and then you suddenly have your whole labour in one contraction, there's no getting ready for that. It's just, and also I had to be very much in my head, because I had been a doula, I'd been at lots of births. My husband was there by himself. So I was saying to him, tell me everything's going to be all right. I needed someone to say that to me, but I was also had to be very present. Whereas in my first birth, I hadn't had to be present at all. I could just go into myself. With this one, I was sort of get the bag out, put the things down on the floor, call the midwife whilst coping with the labour coming. So I definitely wish I had had a bit more time to get into that zone and just a bit less responsibility. But as it was, 10 minutes after I gave birth, I was in my bed, all snuggled up with my nice baby, and thinking, you know what, that was really hard. It was so much harder than my first birth. But also, check me out. I did that myself. And it wasn't easy. And it was really, that was much more painful. But I didn't find my first birth that painful. So I feel like I've had experience of both. A birth that wasn't that painful, which I know a lot of people can feel challenged by that, but it wasn't. And a birth that was really, really painful. If I'd have had, if someone had come by offering me a horse tranquilizer at various moments, I would have taken that, but it wasn't there. And I did it, and I get to keep that feeling of that was a hard thing, and I did it with me forever. whenever things get tough, which I'm really grateful for.
Yeah, that's really, I mean, that's the thing, and that can come with any kind of birth. That statement I've heard of women who've had cesarean births as well, when they feel like empowered for. But and was your first the one with the Superman presentation as well?
Yeah,
I love that, because that means a bigger head. So whatever size your baby was, obviously that was much bigger than the biggest baby,
yeah.
because it's got
She
their
actually
arm
had her fist clenched as well. She came out like that.
That makes, and that you did that without much pain. That just shows to me how much more capable our bodies are than we generally give credit for. When people are saying, "Oh, you've got a big baby," ooh, and yet you didn't know that, and so you'd had no fear about that because you didn't know that. So your body just went, "Oh, we have to open a bit bigger." You know, my third was bigger, and my body opened around the bigger. And
it just meant it took a bit longer. You know, that's
a little bit
why
longer
it took.
to open up more.
Yeah,
but it still did it.
So I do wonder now whether, when I felt that thing that, you know, the fetal ejection reflex, you know, that was what I felt in the bath, a sudden overwhelming urge to push. And I got out and I was frightened of doing that by myself, so I put my bum in the air. And I just wonder whether that's when she went like that. And were there to have been a bit midwife there, whether she would have just been born 10 minutes later.
Or whether if it had not been your first, you might have had a mindset of like, this is ordinary, normal, and just done it without thinking, oh, I can't do it until the authority comes, until the midwife is there. She may have done, because what you're telling me is what everyone says. You knew to lie down still in the bath, to not make it go too fast. You knew when to get out, and then your head kicked in to say, got to wait for the midwife. Whereas if you hadn't had that, like you said, if the midwife had been there, or if you don't know, some doula or somebody there, your instincts would have still been leading it. But
I think for me, I think first, you know, my first bit, I needed the reassurance. I think it was something I needed. I'm always interested by that, thinking, I wonder what would have happened. And my hunch is that the baby would have just flown out pretty quickly. Because it was a much more powerful urge then than when I was eventually pushing her out 3 hours later. But I think that I needed to be confident at that point. It would have been a really big stretch, and stressful for me also when the baby, with my second baby, he was born. I knew he was fine instinctively throughout the birth. He was born. I knew exactly what to do. I knew I knew what to do. Whereas with my first, I think the thought of being there with a baby that had just been born and not having anybody with me, I think that would have been terrifying for me. So
she helped you out by putting it down a bit with her hand until, like in that communication thing, she responded. And then your contractions weren't as strong because they needed to be more gentle, to come out gently like that. I think it's amazing. Like, I
feel really lucky, really lucky. And my husband was great as well. He was really, he was a really great support. And it was the one day my doula couldn't be there, so I booked a doula. And because she came at 37 weeks, she wasn't
great.
So she was brilliant before and she was brilliant afterwards, but it was, he wasn't expecting to be just him for most of the labour, and he was really great, and he was really great the second time as well, even though he didn't believe me. I was like, it's just going to be you and me when this baby is born the second time, and he didn't believe me. He was like, be fine, but he was very, very calm, and he does always get all the credit though. I don't know if you find that.
This is something
people, when we tell that story,
that interviews, as if it's not you that's being, it's more of the feminist stuff. Who gave birth? You did. He was your assistant. He had a very important role of holding the space, protecting her. Who did the giving birth? You. Who gets it? It's as if he needed to be rescuing you there, as if you couldn't have done that totally on your own without him there. It wouldn't have happened. Of course the baby would come out without you there. So this is, and I've spoken to a couple of other people in a couple of interviews where the woman in the room gets ignored for the man in different situations. Happens in boardrooms, Barack Obama, and people have talked about that in that level, and it happens in the birth room. Who you talk to, man. I've heard examples of stories where people say, tell your wife that she needs to do this intervention. And the husband will go, ask her. She's having it done to her body. Ask her. I'm supporting her, but you need to ask her. And again, like you're saying, that even with who you are and what you stand for, and you knowing your rights and different things, you're still noticing around, like your husband got attention, and that's
people
great,
will still,
but he
yeah,
did a great job.
People will still say, oh, so your husband delivered the baby to me after that story, and I say no. I mean, he was great, but you know, I dealt with the labour and told him what to do and then pushed the baby out. I mean, he was there.
Yeah.
He didn't freak out. He was very calm, but it's definitely my show. And it is fascinating that is almost universally the reaction to that story is your husband delivered the baby.
And I think that's a real thing that you're doing in a really subtle, small way, because a lot of, you know, in this whole summit, subtle, small way. So each person that you've talked to and you've gone, no, he didn't, and there's a small little thing there that's changing people. No, bring it back into that you did that, and it just tiny, like little drops in the ocean everywhere. And so
I think that's really important to do. It's one of the things I did in my pregnancy and birth book, is instead of, you know, every week in a lot of pregnancy and birth books, there's a way of imagining how big the fetus is. You know, it's the size of a grape, it's the size of an orange, it's the size of a cucumber. And I made the decision to instead describe the height of the uterus. Like, your uterus is now 10 centimeters higher, it's now 11 centimeters higher, and to go through the book and think about the ways that women's bodies are usually conceptualized in pregnancy and birth, which is often as a container, and instead find a new way to talk about it that makes you in charge of your body and it still relate to you. And it's subtle, people wouldn't necessarily know that, but there was a lot of thought behind it, that you would read this and you would come away feeling that your uterus still belonged to you, rather than it was entirely given over to the baby and the medical profession, that it was still part of your body. And I think that's really important. It's really important in the language we use around birth as well.
I was just thinking that before you said it, that the language is so important, because it reflects what the belief systems are behind, which is the energy with what's happening. So when you change the language, you are changing indirectly the belief systems, and at least being conscious of it, you can be conscious, why am I choosing this language? So for me, it doesn't matter whether, for example, whether you use the word contraction or surge like they do in a lot of hypnobirthing, but when you make that choice for you, what feels good for you, and you're asking people, and then like you said, like, am I allowed, or who's doing the delivering, or are you catching, or the different language used, and you've probably got some better examples of the human rights kind of language, of way of phrasing it, whether it's more gentle, whether it's more empowering. Really important, because I think it really, if you've asked someone to change their language because their language is like a power imbalance or a mismatch, and they do, it changes the dynamic. And they're able to then access their own humanity. Everyone's accessing the humanity, and you're saying, see me, I'm here, and this is me. And
I think it is one of the things that, so I, you know, the first few things I campaigned around in birth were to do with home birth. And I'm always careful about talking about home birth, as I said, but one of the reasons why I wanted a home birth, I had absolutely no ideological thoughts about how someone should give birth or what was best, and I have to say, I didn't care that much. You know, I was thinking about what was going to be best for me and my baby, but I was also it wasn't that I didn't want my baby to have any drugs in their system. It wasn't a kind of purist thing. It was about wanting to feel safe. And I instinctively knew that if someone came to my house, I would have more power than if I went to their house, because I know myself well enough to know that I'm quite a people pleaser. I like to follow the rules. I find it quite uncomfortable not doing that. So if I'm in my house, then they're my rules. And that you notice that in a home birth versus hospital birth, in the language people use, because they have to, you know, the midwives have to ask your permission to go to the loo and where the biscuits are, and where and that very subtle shift in who knows their way around, who knows the geography, puts you in a different position a lot of the time. And that's why I always like home births, because not because you know it's necessary, I necessarily think that's the right way to give birth, but because of the environment that it creates, and the extra power that it gives to women. And I think you notice it in the language. Who is the person saying, please, may I, where is the can I? It's often not the woman, it's often the people who come into the house, who are there to do a wonderful thing, but it's a good reframing in a culture that makes often the woman who's saying, please could I have some water in a hospital setting, am I allowed to drink some water?
And when you're at home, you know where the water is yourself. If you want a drink, you go, can you get me a drink? Someone might ask. So when you're in the hospital, there's that unknown factor of, will I be able to have a drink when I want? And there could be worries or fears about that, and you still have to ask. But at home, you don't need to think about that until the point where you do need a glass of water. It's not even in your mind, because either you can get it yourself or you can ask someone to, and you know where it is, your partner's there, you know there is water there is food there, you know what's in your fridge. All these known factors in a situation where there's a lot of unknowns, because it's birth and we don't know when it's going to happen, how long it's for, all those unknowns. You've got a whole lot of security, safety in your own home of what you do know. So
yeah, absolutely.
Really, yeah. I chose, well, there's a lot of parallels. I chose home birth for some same reasons and some different reasons as well. I felt safest, and mine came early at 39 weeks, but earlier than what I was expecting. I was expecting it might be more average. So and it gave me a lot of confidence as a person, as a woman, to think I did that, and then to use that in my life. So
I think it's a great gift if we're able to do that. And unfortunately, a lot of the times it is out, there are things we can do to make certain kinds of birth more likely, but ultimately that experience where you feel you're enabled to have that positive feeling, whether you're at home or in a hospital or birth centre setting, that is in the hands of other people a lot of the time. And you can do, you can try and get the right people around you, try and give birth in a place where their values are more likely to mirror your values. But ultimately, and that's why Birthrights does most of its work with midwives and doctors, because it actually feels a bit unfair to say to women, you've got to know all this stuff, you've got to demand your rights, when actually, the demanding, sometimes you can demand away. So I think it's really amazing to see a lot of things changing at a policy level, at a practice level, and how invested and involved the Royal Colleges of Midwives and Obstetricians are in exactly what we've been talking about today. And for me, that's the most exciting thing at the moment. Of course, I want people to understand their rights and have loads of great information, but it's also not on, if you're a pregnant woman listening, it's not on you to challenge and change the system. You just do as you be doing life, muddle through as best you can, work out what's best for you and go with it. But it won't be, if things go a different way, that's not on you either. It's on the system you're entering. And that's where I think a lot of us activists have to put our attention to the system, so that women don't feel that if only they do things a certain way, it is guaranteed to be fine, because that makes you feel like a failure if it doesn't happen. And often there are things that are a little bit out of your control.
I'd like there to be a world in the future where it wasn't necessary, like you said, to be clued up on these things. I think at the moment it's like women are saying what they want, and it's so helpful for them to know the rights and things. And like you said, there's other work going on at the same time, from both ends, from within, from without. But like you said, at a point you were saying at the beginning of not getting women fighting against each other, missing the point. It's like working together. So even on this summit, there's like 50-50 birth professionals and pregnant women, because we're all women ultimately wanting a better respect and dignity and birth experience, however that happens. So what I meant to do was actually ask you, what's your vision for the future of birth and motherhood, but I ended up talking kind of like my own vision.
I think I share your vision. I mean, I think something cohesive, and something that recognizes the values and the different experiences that everybody can bring to birth, the most experienced professor of obstetrics or professor of midwifery and the first time mother, but that ultimately recognises that the person that this means most to, that has the stakes are highest for, that is the greatest expert in this particular situation, is the woman. And the person giving birth is always the greatest expert in the room. And I have a vision in which we get to a place where that is recognised. Nobody is ever going to know as much about my history and my body and how I feel as me. And so while I will always need a team, if I ever give birth again, I will always need that team to bring different things. I get to be the expert, and everybody treats me like I'm the professor of me in that situation. And I'd like that to happen for everyone, particularly for those who are most vulnerable. Women who face multiple disadvantage, some women who may have physical or sensory disabilities, women who come to birth with things that are more likely to make them at risk of not being listened to or falling through cracks in the system. And I think also if we can get to a place where they are nurtured and valued and treated in a way that is respectful, then that will be a system that works for all of us.
Yeah, beautiful. So we probably talk all day, but
yeah,
other things to do. What would be, if there was one thing you'd really love women to take away and support her getting the confident birth that's right for her, what would you say to her?
Oh, I think it's always just that you matter. You are incredibly important, and you matter just as much, if not more, when you're pregnant and when you're a mother as you did before. And sometimes it takes active resistance against a lot of things to hang on to that sense of yourself and to believe that you are important and that you're deserving of time and attention, whether that's an extra 5 minutes in a consultation with a midwife, but know that you matter, that you are important, and that one of the most important things you can do as you go into pregnancy and new motherhood is to hang on to that and to remember it, and to find somebody who will say it to you every week if you're finding it difficult to remember.
Wonderful. Thank you. I love that. I do a lot of work with for want of like you matter myself, so I love that. That's been my journey, learning to believe that I matter. So I love that for me as well personally. And thank you so much for coming on. It's been a wonderful interview. I'm really grateful that you've come and spoken today.
Oh, thank you so much for doing it. This is a wonderful summit, and I know that everyone who's watching will be getting a huge amount out of it. And if you didn't know that you mattered before, look at what you're doing now.
Yeah, you're amazing. So yeah, I hope everyone can really hear that. So thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much.